should read the book because payments are everywhere. It touches upon your daily life. It's critical plumbing. If it stops working, you'll notice it very fast, like when the electricity stops or the water system stops. It touches upon things like geopolitics and data. So yes, you should be aware of payments, and that's those pipes that run everywhere and transport the magic money, make your life easy, but may have consequences that you're not aware of. Plus, it's just a fascinating topic. So why did I write this book? Or why did we write this book, I should say? There wasn't really a good book about payments for the general audience, at least not recent. I'm so enthusiastic about payments that I couldn't conceive why anybody else wouldn't be as interested. So I said, there isn't a good book that describes it. So let me start writing it. So I just started writing. This was in the months before COVID, and then COVID gave me the perfect excuse to keep going. And then when I had finished the script, I showed it to a long-term co-worker of mine, Natasha de Terran, who was my head of public relations and public affairs at SWIFT and a former journalist. And she said, yeah, nice try, but why don't we write an actually interesting book about payments? And I think we now have something that really gets around payments, how it affects people the world over, what's changing, what are some of the day-to-day issues in terms of behavior, how does it influence how we shop, how does it influence how we borrow, how does it influence where our data is, what's the geopolitics of it, etc. All of which is now covered in the book. Perhaps what surprised me most is the outsized role of China and how big payments has become in China. Just to give you an idea, in China alone, people make over $500 billion electronic payments per year. That is more than the rest of the world put together. That's largely driven by two super apps, WeChat and Alipay. And it is hard to comprehend for us in the West how big these two have become and how people interact with them. The average Chinese doesn't carry cash anymore. They will use those apps 5 or 10 times a day for everything. And it's happened in just 5 years. I mean, the apps were there before, but the real growth took place in the past 5 years, feeding off mass penetration of smartphones, and it's just exploded. And I had not realized how big it had become until I started analyzing the numbers and talking to people about who live in China and how it works. And the other country that I found fascinating was India. It's another giant country, 1.5 billion inhabitants. That's also interesting. Where in China, the new players are sort of displacing the bank system. In India, they launched this UPI, the Uniform Payment Interface, which allows any app to plug into the banking system and launch a payment or consult a balance, which is a little bit comparable to what we have in Europe with PSD2. It's a completely different growth, but it's growing even faster than in China. UPI is growing at over 100% a year. It's more than doubling every year. I think there was a period when it doubled every month. It's from a lower base than in China, but it's going very fast. COVID has sort of accelerated the move away from cash. And we find that in countries, my own country, Holland and Sweden, lots of youngsters don't carry cash anymore. And there comes a moment, and it's approaching fast, I think, where merchants and shopkeepers are saying, why keep accepting cash with the cost of dropping it off at the end of the day, keeping change for those few people who still need it? We're going to stop accepting cash. That will be quite a change, because then all of a sudden we're going to move into a world where cash exists. We're not going to do away with the euro, but it will disappear from everyday life. And what does that mean? How is that going to change our relationship with money? How is that going to change how we spend it, how we teach children how it works? All these things I think are fascinating. Clearly, banks play a big role in payments, right? Banks are everywhere. But one of the key questions I struggled with almost when writing the book, or we struggled with, is what's the future for banks in payments? And I'm in two minds, and I'd like to make predictions, but I really have learned to my disgrace that making predictions in payments is a fool's errand, especially with the change of pace, the pace of change that we have right now. So I'll stay away from that. So with their banks, I still think that for a consumer, perhaps the best analogy is telcos. They went from being everywhere and you would pay per click, you would pay for every call. And now the value is captured by apps that sit on your mobile phone, right? By WhatsApp, by FaceTime of Apple. And the tech giants have the customer interface, and the telcos run their utilities. They run the pipes. Well, banks may be relegated to utilities as well. They may become regulated utilities. What that means for banks is I think, quite a challenge. They will face an enormous challenge to keep up. It can be done. Banks have innovated themselves. We all have good banking apps, and the bank right now is very different from the bank we had 20 years ago. You don't have to go into a branch if you don't want to. Everything can be done online. They're also going to have to reinvent their business model, like the telcos did. They went from pay per minute to actually monthly charges, data plans, and all these things. I think banks are going to have to rethink what their role is and what their pricing is. At the same time, I can't help but think that banks play a role in our society that is hard to capture by others, and that is to extend credit and provide liquidity in the system. That's especially relevant at the wholesale end. And I'm not quite sure how that role is going to be replicated by non-banks without introducing big risks that are beyond the scope of regulators, which is always scary. And to give one example, we all talk about crypto and how it could do away with banks. Well, even in a crypto world and in a token world, you will need liquidity. Yeah? You will need people to help you smooth these payment flows, especially if they're large. I think there's a real role for banks at the end of the day. They provide liquidity. And I would like to think that even in a world of crypto, somebody has to do that. And there's a natural role for banks. So what about crypto? We dedicate 3 chapters to it in the book. I have been fascinated with Bitcoin from the start. I found it genius, pure genius, the way it's engineered, the protocol that you can have a payment without any individual backing it, without a state behind it, and it purely relies on the math of the crypto algorithms that drive it. The whole concept of mining, I think, is very cleverly engineered. So I've been fascinated by it from the start. On the other hand, I've seen that it hasn't really broken through as a payment mechanism. I mean, Bitcoin is not accepted in a lot of places. So it's proven a great store of value, if you will. It's a great replacement of gold. And whether that will last, we'll see. But it's not a great transaction mechanism. Now, that could change if new technologies are introduced, other forms of crypto. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens if central banks throw their weight behind it. Will that make it a better transaction mechanisms with perhaps different technologies behind it? I don't know. I'd like to think that it will challenge the banks. That's always good. On the other hand, I don't think the current payment system will sit still. And from a payments perspective, we've come a long way from a world where cross-border payments were almost impossible to make. The banking system is becoming real-time as we speak. So a lot of the problems that crypto tries to solve are being solved anyway.